This holiday treat was found on the tables of many families during the 19th and early 20th centuries, but now it's usually found in a few key areas. The main ingredient was so common it was called the fast food of the nation. While the main ingredient has been eaten for millennia, the holiday version has only been around for a few hundred years. We're exploring the history and origins of oyster stuffing. I'm your host, Glenn Warren, and welcome to another serving of Seasons Eatings, the podcast which explores the history and origins of your favorite Christmas foods. Seasons Eatings can be found wherever you download your favorite podcasts. Seasons Eatings is also found on Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, and Twitter. If you love the show, then I humbly ask you to share this podcast with someone you think would love to hear more about the history of Christmas and the foods which shape the holiday we love so much. And if you want to give me suggestions for future episodes, just email me at seasonseatingspodcast@gmail.com. All the links can be found in the show notes at seasonseatingspodcast.com. There are countless variations of stuffing. Some families add sausage to their stuffing and maybe apples too. Others just keep it simple, relying on the juices of the turkey for flavor. Plenty of people can't imagine stuffing made with anything other than cornbread, while others don't care what bread is used as long as chestnuts have a starring role. Some recipes call for no bread at all, opting for rice or soda crackers instead. Oyster dressing, or stuffing, is a favorite of New Englanders that dates back to the 18th century in America, as oysters were predominantly found along the eastern coast of North America. Oysters have been used with or without breadcrumbs for poultry stuffing or fish for over 335 years. The tradition of oyster dressing was brought over from British colonists that settled in America. In Britain, oysters were added to stuffing that was more traditionally used in fowl, fish, calf's head, leg of mutton, rabbit, and pigs. Now, I'm using the terms stuffing and dressing interchangeably throughout this episode. One could be picky and say that stuffing was traditionally placed inside an animal, usually a turkey, and then cooked within. Dressing, on the other hand, is made separately and cooked apart from the main protein. But nowadays, the terms are used regardless of how it's cooked and seem to be regional rather than a particular culinary technique. The first recorded instance of using oysters in stuffing is from a cookbook from the Netherlands, The Sensible Cook, published in 1683. The recipe is for stuffing a capon or hen with oysters and to roast them. Take a good capon cleaned on the inside, then oysters and some finely crushed rusk, pepper, mace, nutmeg powder, and a thin little slice or 3 fresh lemons, and mix together. Fill the bird with this. When it is roasted, one uses a sauce for nothing but the fat from the pan. It is found to be good that way. These recipes were also used in a book used in the New Netherlands, later renamed New York. We have been eating oysters since the beginning of our existence, so their history is as rich and diverse as our own. Oysters were essential to early man as a source of food, and the shells might have been the first knives and spoons. There's even evidence to suggest that Neolithic chefs cook oysters and spice their food. Mineral fragments found in ancient cooking pots conjure images of a bubbling broth of oysters and fresh cod seasoned with a little garlic mustard seed. To the Romans, the native British oyster was a fabled delicacy, fish from the areas such as Whitstable Bay and the Fall River estuary in Cornwall. Similar to today, oysters were served on the shell with a dressing of pepper, lovage, egg yolk, vinegar, garum, olive oil, and wine. They were also prescribed for a number of ailments, including indigestion, ulcers, and anemia. Oysters are continued to be enjoyed for the centuries. By the 19th century, oysters were dredged in huge numbers along the coast by fleets of oyster smacks, and the bivalve was eaten in prodigious quantities. By 1851, 500 million oysters packed in barrels were going through Billingsgate Market each year, flooding the streets of London, where they were mainly eaten by the working class. Found on almost every street corner, they were the original fast food. As Sam Weller remarks in Charles Dickens's The Pickwick Papers, poverty and oysters always seem to go together. The same goes for North America. Authors Keith Stavely and Kathleen Fitzgerald, whose books include America's Founding Food, The Story of New England Cooking and Northern Hospitality, Cooking by the Book of New England, says oyster eating in the region goes back to unrecorded prehistory, with Native Americans and pilgrims alike including the shellfish in their diets. Oysters among all shellfish are the ones that have been in both Europe and America, and the most consistently popular among all levels of society, going way back, Stavely said. Because of that, English settlers arriving on North American shores already had their own well-established tradition of consuming the shellfish. But, Fitzgerald says, they were amazed by the abundance and the size of the oysters they found in their new home. According to Fitzgerald, a pickling recipe for the wife of a merchant, dated around the same time as the American Revolution, begins, "Take 200 oysters, the freshest you can get." They were so plentiful back then, she says, that barrels of pickled oysters were exported to Barbados. They weren't just the way we eat them now, as a special treat, she said. They were a really standard part of the diet. Oysters used to be more plentiful and the most commonly eaten shellfish in America. They were cheap and plentiful enough for the working class to afford. Many early American cooks stuffed their turkeys and chicken with oysters since it was an inexpensive source of protein. Turkeys were very expensive, and adding the oysters helped ensure there was enough protein to feed a large group. As the express wagons and railroads made it more possible to transport goods in the mid-19th century, the oyster market was able to expand and set off a national oyster addiction. Fresh, raw oysters were commonly served in taverns, as oysters were a cheap food to serve with beer and liquor. By 1850, every major town in America had an oyster saloon, also known as oyster bars, oyster house, or a raw bar. Another early recipe I have for using oysters is from the accomplished cook in London in 1685. In it is a recipe for a stuffing using oysters. Oysters were added to the stuffing and used in calf's head, leg of mutton, which is a sheep, and different fowl. The fowl recipe was named sauce with oysters and bacon. The oysters were cooked and mixed with spices and herbs to fill the pullet's belly and roast it, whereas stuffing for calf's head oysters were mixed with brain, tongue, marrow, suet, eggs, and grated bread. Stuffing used in hare or rabbits and pigs was called a pudding. It was made of grated bread, suet, eggs, and cream. It's basically a form of a bread pudding. And by the 1720s in England, fish were being stuffed and baked. The Cook's and Confectioner's Dictionary from 1723 had a stuffing recipe for fish. So eggs, chive, truffles, and mushrooms mixed with breadcrumbs soaked in milk. This is in the same cookbook. There was a recipe for stuffing of fowl. So veal sweetbreads, marrow, oysters, and anchovies, plus herbs and spices. And to stuff the fowl, you raise up the skin on the breasts of your fowl, stuff the hollow in this farce, and stick them up again. And note the stuffing was placed underneath the skin, not inside the cavity. So placing the stuffing under the skin of a chicken was apparently common custom, as Mrs. Gardner from Boston in 1763 said, "Loosen the skin on the breast of the turkey or fowl and fill it with mock oyster sauce, made up with beef suet, breadcrumbs, anchovy, lemon peel, nutmeg, parsley, thyme, and chopped and mixed with an egg." It's not really a sauce per se. It's more of a stuffing. The only time I've actually put things under the skin of a turkey was when you just put like fresh herbs so you could see them through the skin as it cooks through. I've never actually put a bird, like a whole stuffing, into a turkey skin. And by 1796, Amelia Simmons says to place the stuffing inside the cavity of the bird. And there was some debate as to whether it was the best stuffed under the skin or to stuff the body. Simmons has several different stuffing recipes for turkey and chicken. One is salt pork and bread, beef suet and bread or mashed potatoes, and another one is to smother the fowl in oysters or to fill the bird with dry oysters. So you grate a loaf of bread, chop a score or more of oysters fine, add nutmeg, pepper, and salt to your taste, mix it up in a light force meat to your taste, mix it up with 1/4 of a pound of butter, a spoonful or 2 of cream, and 3 eggs. Stuff the craw with it and make the rest into balls and boil them. Sew up the turkey, dredge it well with flour, put it in a kettle of cold water, cover it and set it over the fire. As the scum begins to rise, that is the actual sort of frothy bit that rises to the top of a soup or in this case, a boiling bird. Take it off, let it boil very slowly for half an hour, and then take off your kettle and keep it close covered. If it be middle size, let it stand in hot water for half an hour, the steam being kept in and will stew it enough. Make it rise, keep the skin whole, tender, and very white. When you dish it, pour a little oyster sauce on the side, lay the balls around, and serve it with the rest of the sauce in a boat. And that recipe was from the Virginia Housewife of 1824 by Mary Randolph. In 1832, in the Boston area, the cook's own book, Chicken Stuffing Recipe, said, "Fill your chickens with young oysters, cut small, truffles, parsley, and spices, and roast them." In the same cookbook, turkey was stuffed with sausage and chestnuts, where fish was stuffed with cut-up fish and breadcrumbs. And there was no distinction between stuffing for chicken or fish. Some cooks use breadcrumbs in turkeys and chickens, and others use breadcrumbs in fish. In an 1844 book, A New System of Domestic Cookery, the London edition, published in Philadelphia, there's a recipe for a baked haddock Scottish fashion, which is stuffed with oysters, chopped but not too small, and breadcrumbs blended with an egg. This apparently became so popular because Mrs. Lincoln published her 1884 Boston Cooking School cookbook. She had a refined oyster stuffing recipe using cracker crumbs, especially for fish. Cracker crumbs today are primarily used for seafood stuffing. Mrs. Lincoln made a distinction between turkey or chicken stuffing and fish stuffing. Turkey or chicken stuffing did not have oysters. And finally, there is one from 1880, Mrs. Parloa's new cookbook and marketing guide for a boiled turkey. So chop half a head of celery very fine, mix it with 1/4 breadcrumbs, 2 scant tablespoonfuls of salt, half a teaspoon of pepper, 2 heaping tablespoonfuls of butter, and 2 eggs. Stuff the turkey with this, sew it up, and truss. The stuffing may be made the same as above, only substitute oysters for the celery and serve with an oyster sauce. So we'll find out how the oyster's popularity was boosted by a king and a queen after the break.
Hey, I'm Matt from North Pole Radio, and I wrote a book with Santa Claus. No, really, I did, and you can read it right now. It's available. It's called Santa in His Own Words, and it tells the story of Santa's life, you guessed it, in his own words. It is a historical, magical journey that begins in the country of Lycia and spans all over the world, finally ending up at the North Pole. Why does Santa live at the North Pole? How do reindeer fly? How did Santa meet the elves? How did Santa meet Mrs. Claus? You can find out all of that and more in this book. You can find it now on Amazon or on Barnes & Noble's website. It's available in paperback or for your e-reader if you prefer that. So go to Amazon or Barnes & Noble and purchase your preferred format today. Thanks for reading, and remember, as always, keep Christmas with you.
Were you the kid who would sit as close to the TV as possible on Friday night to enjoy the likes of Steve Urkel, Corey Matthews, and DJ Tanner? Do you love Halloween, Thanksgiving, and Christmas? Then I've got the podcast for you. I'm Matt, and I am the host of the TGI Podcast, where we take a trip down memory lane with classic TGIF and TGIF adjacent shows from the 90s and beyond, and we like to determine whether or not their Halloween, Thanksgiving, or Christmas episodes should be deemed a holiday classic. If they pass the test, they get a...
You got it, dude!
And if they fail, they're saddled with a...
No way, Jose.
So if you like all the holidays and some other random dates in between, be sure to give us a listen.
Thomas Downing was an American restaurateur and an abolitionist active in New York City during the Victorian era, who was nicknamed the New York Oyster King. He was one of the wealthiest people in New York City at the time of his death. Thomas Downing was born in Chesapeake Bay on Chincoteague Island, Virginia in 1791. His parents were enslaved and eventually freed by Sea Captain John Downing, after learning that owning slaves was not condoned by the Methodist Church. They adopted the name Downing as their own and began working as paid caretakers of Captain Downing's Methodist meeting house. Eventually, they bought some property on the island, and the family began earning extra money by gathering and selling oysters, as well as other seafood such as clams and fish. At the end of the War of 1812, Thomas joined the United States Army and followed it to Philadelphia. There he met and married his wife, freeborn Rebecca West. Thomas worked as a valet, continued oystering, and wanted more out of life than oyster digging. He eventually opened his first oyster bar. This allowed him to keep ties with his family's roots while establishing his new career as an esteemed businessman. Thomas used his knowledge of oystering to his advantage and used his connections to the fishermen to sell the best oysters around. Thomas moved to New York City, where in 1820 he continued as an oysterman, selling his oysters on the street. At the time, oysters were inexpensive and considered common food. Thomas was an innovative businessman who knew how to set his oyster sales apart from the rest. One of the tactics he used to keep a competitive edge was purchasing the best oysters from the captains before any of the other oyster caterers arrived for the auction. When the others showed up to bid on the day's catch, he would pay the favor back to the captains by placing bids on the oysters with no intention of winning them, just to bump up the bidding price among the rest of Thomas's competitors. Another tactic he used was catering to the rich and elite of New York City. When Downing opened the Thomas Downing Oyster House in 1825, It was considered upscale compared to any of the other oyster cellars at the time. By using expensive linens and decorating with fine dining ware and chandeliers, he created an atmosphere that was both welcoming and comfortable for his rich clientele. His restaurant was strategically placed in the heart of New York's business district. The Five Points area, an African-American neighborhood a few blocks away from 5 Broad Street, where the Thomas Downing Oyster House was located, housed many oyster cellars. Oyster cellars were the universal food of New York at the time, similar to a hot dog stand today, but many establishments weren't as trusted as Downing's. That's because he specifically catered it towards the fine dining clientele, with a large dining area, carpet, and chandeliers gracing the hall. Elaborate dishes like oyster stuffed turkeys and pan roast made with wine and chili graced the menu. The competition at the time were known to be dive bars and paled in comparison to the lavish food that was served at the Thomas Downing Oyster House. His menu raised the bar for oysters in fine dining. Some of the dishes he served included roast turkey stuffed with oysters, boned and jellied turkey, creamy oyster stew, pan-fried oysters, roast duck and ham, scalloped oysters, and oyster pie. Aside from being more upscale, Thomas's Oyster Bar was unique because women and children were encouraged by Thomas to dine there, as long as they were accompanied by their husbands or fathers. This was actually fairly unusual because, as the only females that were generally allowed to enter oyster cellars at the time were prostitutes. This at the time meant that African Americans couldn't eat at Downing's restaurant, but few were aware of the double life he led. Downing's basement was a key stop in the Underground Railroad, and as an abolitionist, he helped many that were escaping the South in search of freedom. He also led political efforts, funding schools for African American children and leading the fight in desegregating New York's trolley system. By 1835, Downing expanded his business to 3 and 7 Broad Street. He further innovated by adding catering and mail order options to his restaurant. During the height of its success in 1842, Thomas's catering business was chosen by the city of New York to cater the Boz Ball, an event which welcomed famous British author Charles Dickens to America. Internationally known, Thomas would ship his oysters pickled, fried, or live to customers far and wide. One of the most notable recipients of his oysters was Queen Victoria. The Queen enjoyed her oysters so much that she wrote Thomas a letter thanking him and gifted him a gold chronometer watch, which became a Downing family heirloom. As Queen Victoria never traveled outside of Europe, this story may not in fact be true. When Thomas died in 1866, his son George continued to run the restaurant until 1871. By 1910, the oyster population in New York had declined so much because it was due to overfishing and pollution. Oysters now can be found in tin form to be enjoyed any time of the year, but it's during the holidays this special treat comes to mind. Along with family and friends, the holiday dinner invites history, tradition, and a blending of cultures to the table. Across the nation, it's often regional cooking with local ingredients that defines the menu. And so it goes for oyster stuffing. There are many variations. One thing curious cooks have discussed and tested is whether you need to shuck fresh oysters or if you have to use oysters packed in a jar in their own liquid. The general consensus? It doesn't matter. One bit of difference. It always turns out the same. Delicious. I'm your host, Glenn Warren, and thank you for listening to this serving of Seasons Eatings. Seasons Eatings is available wherever you get your favorite podcasts. And please, if you can leave a review about the show so we can spread the Christmas cheer. If you let me know you've left a review, I'll send you a Seasons Eatings sticker as a personal thank you. Also, I would love to hear from you. You can send me an email at seasonseatingspodcast@gmail.com to let me know how you like the show, suggestions for future episodes, or just to say hi. I know we all get busy, so even sharing the podcast with someone you know who loves Christmas would be a big help. And if you're feeling extra generous this season, you can buy me an eggnog. Head on over to seasonseatingspodcast.com, click on the little cup in the corner. Each small donation helps with the daily running of the podcast and is greatly appreciated. Thank you for listening, and tune in again for another serving of Seasons Eatings. All music for Seasons Eatings is used under the Creative Commons license.